Good afternoon. Week 12, and I have a problem. The idea of this series of vlogs is to enthuse you about and perhaps even introduce you to the artists I consider to be the best 100 of all time. But by any objective measure, today's group are the best group of all time. Not necessarily my favourite. They're my second favourite group, but objectively, they are the best group of all time. And if you don't already know about the Beatles, it either means you're not all that interested in music, or a youngster who's not had a proper education. So today, I'm going to assume you already know a bit about the Beatles. So my challenge is to find a few facts that not everybody will realise. Fact 1. It took the Beatles 5 years before they got a record contract. Lots of modern groups would have fallen by the wayside long before then. Admittedly, they were only 15 and 16 when Lennon and McCartney first met at a church fete where Lennon's skiffle group were playing. But this was 1957. It was the first Beatles record, didn't come out till 1962. Put it in a bit of context, Cliff Richard, born pretty much the same week as John Lennon. He was already a superstar by 1958. Also, next fact, the Beatles didn't immediately earn a record contract. Although rock and roll in the 50s had been very guitar based, it had faded. When the Beatles came on the scene, it's easy to overlook the fact that rock and roll was in decline. Guitar music, a lot of people thought, was on the way out. One of the people who thought guitar music was on the way out was a guy called Dick Rowett, Decca Records, and that's one of the reasons why he actually turned down the opportunity to sign the Beatles. Dick Rowe, don't feel too sorry for him. He remedied this mistake later by signing the Rolling Stones instead. Next fact. Back when the Beatles started, nearly everybody recorded somebody else's material. It was unusual to write most of your own material. I've written this down. I believed it to be true as I prepared this talk. I've just thought of somebody who did write his own material before the Beatles, Chuck Berry. But apart from Chuck Berry, barely anybody else wrote their own material. So when their debut album included 8 Lennon and McCartney songs and just 6 covers, it was quite jaw-dropping. As time went on, they'd do fewer and fewer covers and more of their own material, and other groups were quick to follow suit. The Rolling Stones' first album was nearly all covers, but they followed the Beatles' example and started writing their own material. Once they got writing, boy, were they prolific. The first full year of Beatlemania was 1963. The first record came out towards the end of... The first single came out in 62, but the first album came out in 1963. The second album came out in 1963. They also released three number one singles and B-sides, not on those albums. I've totted it all up, and in that year they released 34 tracks of their own. Adele, the closest modern equivalent to the Beatles commercially, has been going for 12 years now, and if you count up all the songs she's put out on her 3 albums and her 1 James Bond soundtrack. I think she's recorded 35 songs. So, Beatles did 34 songs in 1 year. Adele's beaten them just by 1 song over 11 years. And actually, even that doesn't tell the whole story, because they were so prolific, Lennon and McCartney, and so popular, they had spare songs which they weren't going to use, which they gave away. So there were at least another 3 singles which charted in 1963, which were written by Lennon and McCartney, but which were performed by other artists like Cilla Black and Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas. He had a #1 hit, in fact, with the song Bad to Me in August 1963. It is almost impossible today to imagine how massive an impact the Beatles had in the 60s. It was unprecedented, it's unmatched since. They dominated first the UK charts, then the USA charts, then the rest of the world. The week ending April the 4th, 1964, they had the top 5 singles in the US charts. These were 5 genuine singles. They are the best-selling band ever, with estimated sales of 800 million, as well as being liked by most music critics. Yeah, the much more popular music critics than, let's say, BTS or Justin Bieber or any of today's megastars. Every single album they released reached #1, and when you include compilations, they've had 15 #1 UK albums, 19 in the USA. They've had 20 #1s in America. In the UK, we've had 17 #1 singles. One negative thing about the Beatles, though, surprisingly, Beatles live concerts don't seem to have been that good. Okay, they were probably an excellent band to see before they got a record contract. I'd love to go back into a TARDIS, get into a TARDIS and go and see the Beatles in the Cavern in the early 60s, or even go across to the Star Club in Hamburg to see them in the early 60s, days before they'd written much of their own material and they were performing rock and roll covers. But when they performed their own material as a band, the concerts were disappointing. Those days, bands only did very short sets, 13 minutes or so. And one problem the Beatles had was the fans who went to the concerts were mainly girls. Not being sexist, it's just true. And they screamed a lot, and you couldn't hear the music, and I think the band got increasingly pissed off at that and stopped caring. It was even the same when they played the stadiums. When they toured America, they played sports stadiums. Their last ever gig was in August 1966 at Candlestick Park in San Francisco, baseball stadium in San Francisco. To give you an idea, tickets only cost between $4.50 and $6.50. Even so, it was far from a sellout. They sold 25,000 seats in a 40,000 capacity stadium. The fans were a long way from the band. They were in a stage in the middle of the pitch or outfield, and the fans were around and they just screamed. You couldn't hear the band in those days. The amplification the band used just wasn't up to the job. These days, bands can be effective in big stadium because they've got big amplification, they've got big screens, and they've got a good light show. Wasn't the case back in the 60s. The last songs they ever performed live went no further than their 6th album, Rubber Soul. They had actually just released Revolver on before their last tour, but they didn't feel up to playing the songs on Revolver. But Rubber Soul and Revolver are great albums because they represent a mind shift in how people viewed albums. Before then, bands were judged mainly on singles, and albums tended to be just collections of singles. The Beatles were the first major band to take an album really seriously, see an album as a piece of art in itself, and pay as much attention to track 12 of the album as to the singles. They were spending longer and longer making the albums. The first album they ever did, they just did it in a day, more or less, or 2 days perhaps, an hour a song. Rubber Soul were spending longer and longer, and were using different instruments. You wouldn't normally expect a band to hear a sitar and a fuzz bass. By the time of Sgt. Pepper in 1967, they were spending 25 hours of studio time per track recording. Doesn't sound a lot by modern standards, but it was a lot by the standards of 1967. At the time, next fact, at the time they did the Sgt. Pepper sessions, they also recorded what many people consider to be the best double A-side single of all time. Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane. Penny Lane, it's certainly in my heart. But, ironically, this, by Beatles standards, was a failure. Because previous to then, they'd had 11 consecutive #1 singles. How ironic that such a great single as Strawberry Fields Forever should be the record to break that sequence. It was beaten into #2 in the charts by Engelbert's Humperdinck and the Green Green Grass of Home. Some consolation came from them though, because they were now becoming an albums band more than just a singles band. Sgt. Pepper was the best-selling album of the decade. And final fact to tell you about the Beatles. Surprisingly, the last Beatles album they ever recorded was not the last Beatles album they ever released. The last album released was Let It Be. But Let It Be was recorded in January 1969, and it was done in conjunction with making the Let It Be film. I said earlier that they'd given up live performance. They did do one last live show. They never did any concerts after 1966 in front of paying customers. They never did any tours. But they did do one last live performance for the Let It Be album on the rooftops of Abbey Road, as we know. And release of the accompanying Let It Be album was held back until the film's release in May 1970, which was disappointingly late considering the band had actually split up in April 1970. In the meantime, later on in 1969, between February 69 and July 69, Abbey Road had been recorded and released. So the last Beatles album to be made was Abbey Road, and what a way to finish. It's my favourite album of theirs. But the last one to be, I've got it the wrong way around. The last Beatles album to be recorded was Abbey Road. The last album to be released was Let It Be. And I'm speaking words of wisdom. See you next week.